In the days and weeks following Japan's surrender in 1945, the once thriving aircraft factories that had fueled its wartime efforts fell silent. These massive industrial sites, where thousands of workers had toiled relentlessly to produce some of the most innovative and deadly aircraft of the war, now faced an uncertain and troubled future. The conflict had ended, but the implications for these factories and the materials within them were only beginning to unfold. The sheer scale of Japan's wartime aircraft production had been immense. In the years leading up to 1945, the country had rapidly expanded its aviation industry, turning out aircraft models that ranged from the sleek, versatile Mitsubishi Zero to the formidable, heavily armored Najima Ki-84. At the peak of production, Japan had more than 100,000 aircraft in service, and its factories churned out thousands of new machines each month. But now, as the war concluded, so too did the demand for military aircraft. The surrender of Japan meant that these factories, which had been built and maintained with one singular purpose in mind, would become obsolete overnight. The consequences of this sudden shift in industrial priorities were immediate and profound. With Japan's economy shattered, the immediate concern was not the fate of military production but the rebuilding of the nation's civilian economy. Factories that had once been devoted to military production had to pivot to civilian uses or face being dismantled altogether. Yet this was far easier said than done. The infrastructure that had supported the manufacturing of warplanes was specialized, costly to maintain, and ill-suited to peacetime production. The vast majority of the workforce, many of whom had been conscripted during the war, were left without jobs. These were not just industrial workers, but scientists, engineers, and designers, many of whom had been involved in the development of advanced aircraft technologies and now found their skills and knowledge sidelined in a post-war economy focused on survival, not innovation. Faced with a crumbling infrastructure and a dire economic situation, the Japanese government, under the direction of the Allied occupation forces, made initial moves to dismantle much of the aircraft industry. The Ministry of Industry, under orders from the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, began to assess the factories and their contents. Equipment, tools, and materials that had been used in the production of military aircraft were considered vital for the reconstruction of the country's civilian economy. However, much of this equipment was too specialized, and the factories were too large to easily convert into civilian manufacturing plants. For many of them, there was no other choice but to scrap everything, often without even removing valuable components. But the task was not as simple as tearing down buildings and cutting up machinery. The logistical challenges of dismantling Japan's vast network of aircraft factories were immense. The factories themselves were scattered across the country, with major sites located in cities like Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. The complexity of removing or repurposing machinery from these sites was compounded by the fact that many of these facilities had been heavily bombed during the war. The damage to infrastructure was severe, and much of the equipment that had survived was rendered unusable due to the lack of spare parts or proper maintenance. The factories weren't the only assets in question. The sprawling production lines, research and development centers, and assembly plants were home to mountains of raw materials, steel, aluminum, titanium, and other metals that had been stockpiled to keep up with the insatiable demands of wartime aviation. Many of these materials were now stranded in factories, where they were effectively rendered useless by the collapse of the wartime economy. Allied forces, eager to prevent any military potential from surviving in Japan, took inventory of these materials, with some being shipped abroad as reparations. However, much of it remained in the country, simply abandoned in warehouses or left to rust in derelict factories. In the early months of post-war occupation, a few aircraft factories were spared immediate dismantling. The U.S. government, under General Douglas MacArthur's direction, was primarily concerned with ensuring Japan's peaceful recovery. While the factories were not immediately destroyed, they were placed under strict supervision. There were efforts to preserve certain technologies or redirect production toward peaceful purposes, such as civilian aircraft manufacturing. However, these efforts were hampered by a lack of materials, expertise, and the necessary infrastructure. Most of Japan's pre-war civilian aviation industry had been subsumed by wartime needs, and the shift back to civilian production would prove difficult and slow. In the interim, Japan's aircraft factories became places of idleness, their potential dormant. The factories themselves, often massive structures once humming with activity, became silent and desolate. Steel machines and assembly lines that had produced hundreds of aircraft were left standing, gathering dust. The workers who had operated these machines, many of whom had been part of the war effort, found themselves displaced in a country facing not just economic ruin but a cultural reckoning. The skilled labor force, once essential to the nation's war machine, was now largely irrelevant in a civilian economy that demanded different skills. Meanwhile, international politics also played a role in shaping the fate of Japan's aircraft factories. The Cold War was already beginning to cast its shadow across the globe, and the United States, along with the Soviet Union, had begun to view Japan through a new geopolitical lens. As the U.S. sought to make Japan a bulwark against the spread of communism in Asia, military production was eventually allowed to resume on a limited scale. This, however, was not a return to the expansive wartime industry that had once existed. Instead, Japan's post-war aviation industry would focus primarily on defensive purposes and the needs of its new self-defense forces. By 1947, some of the larger aircraft factories had been repurposed or restructured to meet these needs. The Japanese government, under the pressure of economic recovery and the changing political landscape, found itself in a precarious position. The factories that had once created military machines of war were now shifting to the more mundane and less glamorous task of rebuilding a peacetime economy. The materials, designs, and technologies that had once given Japan an edge in the skies were now relegated to a footnote in the country's history. Yet, despite the efforts to repurpose these factories, the loss of wartime aircraft production was devastating. It was not just the factories themselves that had been scrapped or abandoned, but also the workforce that had built Japan's military aviation prowess. The skilled engineers, designers, and laborers who had contributed to the country's remarkable achievements in aircraft production during the war were left to navigate a new world where their talents were no longer needed in the same capacity. The rapid conversion of the aviation industry from wartime to peacetime usage could not repair the structural damage done to both the factories and the workers who had once operated them. At this point in history, the fate of Japan's aircraft factories was still very much in flux. With the end of the war came not just the physical dismantling of these industrial sites, but also the erosion of an era of technological dominance. As the factories were repurposed, scrapped, or abandoned, what remained of Japan's wartime aviation legacy was increasingly confined to the pages of history. The remnants of these once proud sites, now relics of a war that had devastated the country, would quietly fade into obscurity, their stories buried beneath the rubble of a nation's reconstruction. The post-war years brought a gradual but inevitable conclusion to the legacy of Japan's aircraft factories, a legacy marked not by the glory of wartime production, but by the disassembly, abandonment, and repurposing that followed. As Japan began to rebuild its shattered economy and regain a foothold in the world, the fate of its aviation industry and the factories that had supported it seemed increasingly distant from the once celebrated triumphs of wartime. Yet, the impact of this transformation on both the industrial landscape and the people involved would continue to resonate for years to come. In the immediate aftermath of the surrender, the Allied occupation forces moved decisively to ensure that Japan's military potential would not be resurrected. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed as the supreme commander for the Allied powers, implemented a wide range of policies designed to demilitarize Japan and prevent any resurgence of its pre-war military might. This meant that the aircraft factories, once the heart of Japan's aviation production, were not only to be dismantled but also, in many cases, effectively erased from the industrial map. Factories that had been built to manufacture everything from fighter planes to bombers were now seen as symbols of the nation's aggressive wartime ambitions, and their continued operation was simply untenable. This was not an easy task. The size of these aircraft factories was staggering, and many of them had been constructed with advanced technologies that were now both expensive and complex to maintain. With the country's industrial base fractured and its economy in ruins, there was little capacity to salvage much from the once thriving military production hubs. Even as the war had ended, These factories, many of them located in major industrial centers such as Nagoya and Tokyo, were still highly specialized in the kinds of production that served Japan's wartime needs. There was, simply put, no civilian use for many of these facilities, nor for the advanced machinery that had once cranked out thousands of aircraft a year. The early days of the occupation saw attempts to repurpose some factories for peaceful purposes. In certain cases, efforts were made to redirect resources to civilian industries, such as the manufacturing of consumer goods or reconstruction materials. But these were short-lived attempts. The specialized nature of the factories, which had been designed with military efficiency in mind, made them unsuited to such a shift. The extensive tooling, precision machinery, and even the layout of the factories themselves had been optimized for one purpose: the production of warplanes. Many factories could not be adapted without significant rebuilding, and such efforts were hampered by the lack of skilled labor and the country's strained resources. Thus, for much of the late 1940s, the fate of Japan's aircraft factories was one of quiet decay. Massive buildings that had once housed cutting-edge technologies and tens of thousands of workers now stood empty or repurposed for menial tasks. The dream of creating a thriving, post-war civilian aviation industry was slowly replaced with the grim reality of a nation trying to piece itself back together after the devastation of the conflict. The idea of reviving a world-class aircraft industry was shelved in favor of more urgent concerns: economic recovery, food production, and rebuilding the nation's infrastructure. At the same time, the dismantling of Japan's aircraft factories and military production lines was not a purely domestic issue. The Allied forces, particularly the United States, saw these factories as not just relics of a defeated enemy but as potential threats in a rapidly changing geopolitical landscape. The growing tensions of the Cold War prompted the U.S. to impose a strict policy of denazification and demilitarization across the country, which meant ensuring that Japan's military capacity was permanently neutralized. This was more than just a symbolic act. The Allies were concerned about the technological knowledge housed within these factories, the engineers, scientists, and designers who had created some of the most advanced aircraft of the era, such as the Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden and the Ki-84 He-8. There was fear that these skilled professionals could be lured into projects that might revive military production in Japan or even contribute to the burgeoning aviation industries of other nations, particularly in the Soviet Union. As the 1950s dawned, the larger industrial factories that had once produced aircraft began to transition to other forms of manufacturing. In many cases, these sites were repurposed for civilian industrial use, such as the production of consumer goods or construction materials. The repurposing of some factories, particularly in the metropolitan areas, provided employment for many of the workers who had been displaced by the collapse of Japan's military-industrial sector. However, for those with specialized skills in aircraft manufacturing, the transition was less straightforward. Engineers, machinists, and factory workers who had once been involved in the production of high-performance military aircraft now found themselves out of work or relegated to less skilled jobs in civilian industries. In the midst of these shifts, some parts of the former aircraft factories were gradually converted to the production of components for Japan's nascent civilian aviation industry. Yet this was a slow and difficult process. Japan's ability to develop civilian aircraft had been stunted by the war, and the country's aircraft industry was still decades away from achieving the same level of technological sophistication it had enjoyed before the conflict. Nonetheless, there were some successes. By the mid-1950s, Japan had begun to build a small but significant domestic aviation industry, with companies like Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Kawasaki Heavy Industries beginning to focus on civilian aircraft manufacturing. This, however, was a far cry from the scale and sophistication of Japan's pre-war aviation industry, which had once been a major player on the world stage. Over time, many of the former aircraft factories that had been spared from complete destruction were simply abandoned. As Japan's economy began to recover and industrial output shifted toward other sectors, the large, specialized factories that had once been devoted to aircraft production became obsolete. The rapid pace of industrialization in post-war Japan meant that the focus was now on creating consumer goods, electronics, and automobiles. industries that would drive the country's economic miracle in the 1960s and 1970s. Aircraft production, now a niche industry, was relegated to a secondary role. As the decades passed, the factories that had been so central to Japan's war effort were gradually dismantled, their equipment sold off or repurposed, and their facilities abandoned to the elements. Yet, not all of Japan's wartime aviation legacy disappeared into obscurity. A few remnants of the aircraft factories, along with their technological expertise, found a second life in the emerging field of aerospace technology. By the 1960s, Japan began to develop a new generation of aircraft, including jet airliners like the Boeing 707-inspired YS-11. The country's aviation sector, while still small in comparison to global giants like the U.S. and the Soviet Union, was beginning to take flight again. The engineers and designers who had worked in the aircraft factories of the 1940s found new opportunities in this growing industry, contributing their expertise to a new era of aviation.